Imagine waking up one morning to the sound of distant explosions, not knowing that your world, and your country's future, would change forever before the sun had even set. The Philippines and Japan's military history is closely intertwined through the events of World War II, when Japan launched a full-scale invasion of the Philippines between 1941 and 1942. At that time, the Philippines was a territory of the United States, and its strategic location in the Pacific made it a crucial target for Japan's expansionist plans. The Japanese attack began on December 8, 1941, just hours after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, striking airfields and military installations to cripple the Philippines' defense capabilities. This coordinated offensive involved both aerial bombardments and naval operations, aimed at quickly overwhelming the combined American and Filipino forces. The Japanese forces, led by General Masaharu Homma, advanced rapidly, capturing key areas and forcing the defenders to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor Island. The defenders, consisting of the United States Armed Forces in the Far East, USAF, and the Philippine Commonwealth Army, faced shortages of food, medicine, and supplies due to Japan's blockade and aggressive assault. Despite determined resistance, the overwhelming Japanese military strength and the lack of reinforcements eventually took a heavy toll. By April 1942, the defenders of Bataan were compelled to surrender, marking one of the largest capitulations in American and Filipino military history. Corregidor, the last major stronghold, fell in May 1942, completing Japan's conquest of the Philippines. This early phase of occupation was part of Japan's broader strategy to control Southeast Asia and secure vital resources for its war effort. The invasion not only altered the military balance in the Pacific, but also deeply impacted the lives of millions of Filipinos, setting the stage for years of hardship, resistance, and eventual liberation. In the early 1940s, the Philippines was not yet an independent nation but a commonwealth under the sovereignty of the United States, preparing for full independence scheduled for 1946. This arrangement meant that the defense of the islands was primarily the responsibility of the U.S. military, though the Philippine Commonwealth Army played an active role alongside them. The archipelago's geographic position in Southeast Asia made it a critical point in controlling sea routes, projecting military power, and safeguarding access to raw materials. For Japan, which had already invaded parts of China and sought to dominate the Asia-Pacific region, the Philippines stood as a major obstacle to its ambitions. Japan's military strategy during World War II was to secure a Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, which involved capturing territories rich in resources and eliminating Western military presence in the region. The U.S. bases in the Philippines, including the massive naval facility at Subic Bay and the fortified island of Corregidor, posed a direct threat to Japan's plans to advance into the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, and beyond. When Japanese forces struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, it was part of a synchronized campaign to neutralize U.S. and Allied power across the Pacific. The attack on the Philippines began just hours after Pearl Harbor, with Japanese bombers targeting airfields such as Clark and Nichols Fields to destroy American air power before it could respond. This swift offensive was coordinated with Japan's simultaneous invasions of Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, and Malaya, demonstrating the scale of its military planning. By including the Philippines in this vast Pacific offensive, Japan aimed to isolate Australia, cut off Allied supply lines, and establish a defensive perimeter that would be difficult for the Allies to penetrate, setting the stage for a prolonged and brutal conflict in the region. The Battle of Bataan was one of the most intense and desperate struggles in the early stages of Japan's invasion of the Philippines. After Japanese forces landed in late 1941, American and Filipino troops, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur and later General Jonathan Wainwright, retreated to the Bataan Peninsula as part of a defensive strategy. 4 months, from January to April 1942, the defenders held their ground despite being heavily outnumbered, lacking supplies, and suffering from disease and exhaustion. The terrain and determined resistance slowed the Japanese advance, but the blockade cut off reinforcements and food, leaving soldiers and civilians in worsening conditions. By April 9, 1942, the situation had become untenable, and Major General Edward King made the decision to surrender more than 76,000 troops, the largest surrender in U.S. military history. The aftermath was a humanitarian catastrophe. The Japanese, unprepared to handle such a large number of prisoners of war, forced them to undertake what became known as the Bataan Death March. Over several days, the prisoners were made to walk approximately 65 miles from Marieville and Bagak to prison camps in Tarlac under the scorching sun, with little food or water. Those who fell behind due to exhaustion, illness, or injury were often beaten, bayonet, or shot. Thousands died during the march from starvation, dehydration, disease, and abuse, with estimates ranging from 7,000 to 10,000 deaths. The brutality shocked the world and became a symbol of the suffering endured by the Filipino and American forces under Japanese occupation. Survivors carried the physical and emotional scars for the rest of their lives, and the events of Bataan became a rallying cry for liberation, symbolizing both the heroism of resistance and the deep tragedy of war. After the formal surrender of U.S. and Filipino forces in 1942, Japanese forces assumed they had neutralized all organized resistance in the Philippines. However, across the archipelago, many Filipinos refused to accept defeat and turned to guerrilla warfare as their means of continuing the fight. These guerrilla units were formed from a mix of escaped soldiers, local volunteers, and even ordinary civilians who took up arms. They operated in remote jungles, mountains, and rural areas, using their knowledge of the terrain to evade capture and launch surprise attacks. Guerrillas disrupted Japanese supply lines, gathered intelligence, sabotaged infrastructure, and provided shelter to refugees and escapees. Communication with the outside world was risky but crucial. Many guerrilla leaders maintained secret radio contact with Allied forces, relaying valuable information about Japanese troop movements, coastal defenses, and supply routes. This intelligence became essential for planning the Allied return to the Philippines. Some guerrilla groups grew into highly organized forces, numbering in the thousands, and established their own command structures, courts, and supply systems in liberated zones beyond Japanese control. Despite facing brutal reprisals, including massacres of civilians suspected of aiding resistance fighters, the guerrilla movement persisted. In many areas, local communities actively supported these fighters, providing food, information, and recruits. Their determination ensured that Japan never had full control over the islands, keeping the spirit of independence alive. When General Douglas MacArthur began his campaign to liberate the Philippines in October 1944, guerrilla units were ready to assist. They guided Allied troops, secured key locations ahead of major battles, and continued harassing retreating Japanese forces. The guerrilla resistance not only weakened Japanese occupation, but also played a decisive role in accelerating the liberation of the Philippines, proving the resilience and unity of the Filipino people under oppression. The liberation of the Philippines in 1945 marked the culmination of years of struggle against Japanese occupation, but it came at an immense human cost. After U.S. forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, returned to Leyte in October 1944, they advanced steadily through the islands, determined to recapture Manila, the nation's capital. By early February 1945, American troops, supported by Filipino guerrillas, began their assault on the city, which was still held by Japanese forces under the command of Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi. Although Japanese High Command had initially ordered a withdrawal, Iwabuchi chose to defend Manila to the last man, transforming it into a fortress. What followed was one of the most brutal urban battles of the Pacific War. The Japanese entrenched themselves in government buildings, churches, schools, and private homes, using civilians as shields and laying deadly traps throughout the city. U.S. forces employed heavy artillery, tanks, and airstrikes to dislodge them, which, combined with the Japanese strategy of total resistance, resulted in catastrophic destruction. Civilians suffered terribly during the month-long battle. Japanese troops carried out mass killings, torture, and other atrocities, while the crossfire and bombardment killed thousands more. By the time the city was secured in early March 1945, an estimated 100,000 civilians had lost their lives, and much of Manila lay in ruins. Historic landmarks, cultural treasures, and entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. The recapture of Manila was both a military victory and a profound tragedy. While it symbolized the nearing end of Japanese occupation and the restoration of Philippine sovereignty, it also left deep physical and emotional scars. The devastation of the city and the staggering civilian toll became one of the darkest chapters in Philippine history, remembered as a somber cost of liberation. The legacy of the war between the Philippines and Japan left deep wounds, but it also laid the groundwork for a gradual process of reconciliation that transformed the relationship between the two nations. In the immediate aftermath of 1945, memories of the invasion, occupation, and atrocities such as the Bataan Death March and the destruction of Manila fueled widespread resentment among Filipinos. Many survivors carried personal and collective grief, and rebuilding the nation required immense effort. Japan, devastated by its own defeat and occupation, faced the challenge of redefining its role in the international community, particularly in Asia. The road to reconciliation began with Japan's post-war commitment to peace, enshrined in its new constitution, and its willingness to offer reparations. In 1956, the Philippines and Japan signed the Reparations Agreement, through which Japan provided economic aid and technical assistance as part of war damage settlement. These reparations supported infrastructure projects, industrial development, and economic recovery in the Philippines, fostering a sense of cooperation. Over the decades, diplomatic, economic, and cultural ties strengthened. Japan became one of the Philippines' largest trading partners, investors, and providers of development assistance. Exchanges in education, technology, and tourism encouraged mutual understanding, while formal state visits by leaders of both nations symbolized the mending of relations. Despite lingering historical pain, especially among war survivors and their families, both countries chose to focus on building a forward-looking partnership. Shared strategic interests, including maritime security, disaster relief, and regional stability, further solidified their alliance. Today, the relationship between the Philippines and Japan stands as an example of how former wartime adversaries can move beyond conflict, acknowledging the past while working together toward mutual prosperity and peace, showing that reconciliation, though difficult, is possible through sustained dialogue and cooperation. The story of the Philippines and Japan during World War II is one of hardship, courage, and transformation. From the sudden invasion and the desperate defense at Bataan, to the unyielding spirit of the guerrilla resistance, and the fierce struggle for liberation, the conflict tested the endurance of both nations in ways that changed them forever. It left scars, cities destroyed, lives lost, and memories of suffering that would echo for generations. Yet, in the years that followed, these former enemies found a way to reconcile, turning the bitterness of war into a foundation for friendship. Today, the Philippines and Japan stand not as adversaries, but as partners, bound by shared history, mutual respect, and a commitment to peace. Their journey reminds us that even the deepest wounds can heal, and that the bonds forged after conflict can be stronger than the divisions that once separated us.